Ted Bundy. The man who somehow convinced an entire generation of women that a broken arm and a Volkswagen Beetle were not red flags. Confessed to 30 murders. Probably did more. Escaped from prison twice. The second time he fled to Florida and just kept going. Because Ted Bundy was not the kind of guy who took a loss and reflected on his choices. He was caught again, obviously. Tried, convicted, sentenced to death. And here's where it gets almost poetic. Ted Bundy, a man who spent his entire life manipulating people, charming his way out of every situation, convincing judges, jurors, and entire courtrooms that he was just a misunderstood guy, spent his final years desperately trying to delay his execution by confessing to more murders. One by one. Like he was rationing them. I'll give you another one if you let me live another month. The FBI played along just long enough to get the information. Then they executed him anyway. January 24th, 1989. Florida State Prison. He sat in the electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky, which is somehow both terrifying and deeply Floridian, and 2,000 volts ended the most documented, most studied, most annoyingly charismatic serial killer in American history. Outside the prison, people were cheering, literally throwing parties. Someone had a sign that said, "Burn Bundy, burn." Florida really committed to the bit. He was 42 years old. He had charmed his way through life for 4 decades. And in the end, the only thing that outsmarted Ted Bundy was electricity. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy killed 33 young men and boys. He buried 26 of them under his house. Under his house. And somehow continued living there, hosting neighborhood parties, dressing up as a clown for children's birthdays. He literally had an alter ego called Pogo the Clown, and being named Man of the Year by his local Democratic Party chapter. America was absolutely not paying attention. When they finally arrested him in 1978, the smell from under his house had apparently been a complaint for years. He told neighbors it was a moisture problem. Sir, that is not a moisture problem. He was convicted of all 33 murders, which at the time was the highest murder count for a single convicted killer in American history. A record he seemed almost proud of. While on death row, Gacy painted. Clowns mostly. His clown paintings became collector's items. People bought them. Willingly. With money. There is no explaining human beings. He was executed on May 10th, 1994, by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. His last meal was fried chicken, shrimp, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. A pound. He ate a pound of strawberries before he died. His last words were, "Kiss my ass." Direct, efficient. Somehow the most honest thing he ever said. The lethal injection took 18 minutes, which was longer than expected because one of the chemicals clogged the IV line. Even the execution was inconvenienced by John Wayne Gacy. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer did not get a dramatic execution. No electric chair, no lethal injection, no final statement carefully prepared for the cameras. Dahmer was beaten to death with a metal bar in a prison bathroom in Wisconsin by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver. Dahmer had been convicted in 1992 of 15 murders. The details of what he did are not suitable for a family-friendly description, but let's just say he combined murder with a culinary hobby and a taxidermy phase, and leave it at that. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, which is the judicial equivalent of "we want to be extremely clear." In prison, Dahmer was apparently calm, cooperative. He converted to Christianity. He gave interviews. He seemed, by all accounts, genuinely remorseful, which is a deeply uncomfortable thing to say about a man who did what he did, but multiple people who interacted with him confirmed it. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer and 2 other inmates were assigned to clean the prison gym bathroom. Christopher Scarver, who was serving time for murder, had been vocal about his contempt for Dahmer and another inmate named Jesse Anderson. He had fashioned a metal bar from gym equipment. The guards came back to find Dahmer with fatal head injuries. He died about 2 hours later at a local hospital. Scarver later said that Dahmer had been provoking other inmates. reportedly making food out of prison condiments shaped to look like severed limbs, which, if true, is the most Jeffrey Dahmer thing that has ever been reported about Jeffrey Dahmer. He was 34 years old. No dramatic final chapter, just a prison bathroom in Wisconsin. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos is one of the most complicated figures in this entire video, and that is saying something given the company she's keeping. She killed 7 men along Florida highways between 1989 and 1990, all of whom she claimed had either raped her or attempted to. She was a sex worker. She was also, by any reasonable clinical assessment, severely mentally ill, with a childhood so catastrophically abusive that multiple psychiatrists testified it was a miracle she'd survived it at all. None of that saved her. She was convicted and sentenced to death 6 times, 6 separate death sentences. Florida really does commit to the bit. What makes Wuornos genuinely tragic, and different from most people on this list, is that in her final years she actively wanted to die. She fired her lawyers. She waived her appeals. She told the courts she was sane and ready. In interviews, she was erratic, angry, at times incoherent. And those same interviews were used to argue she was mentally competent to be executed. The system decided she was sane enough to kill, but somehow not sick enough to treat. On October 9th, 2002, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last meal was a single cup of coffee. Her last words were a statement about how the government had sonic devices in her head and how she was being persecuted. Then she said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all." Nobody really knew what to do with that. She was 46. The movie Monster, starring Charlize Theron, came out the following year and won the Oscar. Wuornos herself found Hollywood's interest in her story deeply ironic, which honestly feels like the correct response. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, terrorized Los Angeles and San Francisco in 1984 and 1985. He broke into homes at night, killed at least 14 people, and left satanic symbols at crime scenes. He did not pick a demographic. Different ages, different neighborhoods, different everything. The only pattern was the chaos, which made him almost impossible to track. He was caught in 1985, when East LA residents literally beat him up after recognizing him from a newspaper photo. A gang of neighborhood men chased him down, pinned him to the ground, and held him until police arrived. He had evaded one of the largest manhunts in California history, and he was ultimately stopped by some guys in a parking lot who read the newspaper. Outstanding. At trial, Ramirez was theatrical. He flashed a pentagram drawn on his palm. He shouted, "Hail Satan," in the courtroom. He received love letters and marriage proposals from women during the trial, which is a psychological phenomenon so disturbing it has its own name, hybristophilia, and its own dedicated section of every true crime book ever written. He was convicted of 13 murders and sentenced to death. He married one of his pen pals, a magazine editor named Doreen Leoy, in 1996. She maintained his innocence for years. They later separated. Ramirez never made it to execution. He spent over 2 decades on death row, and on June 7, 2013, he died in a hospital from complications of B-cell lymphoma, basically liver failure caused by cancer. He was 53. He had spent 24 years on death row, which in California means he simply outlived the state's ability to get around to executing him. California's death row is less an execution system and more a very long waiting room. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, bind, torture, kill, is currently alive. He is in his late 70s, sitting in a Kansas prison, and he will die there of old age. He killed 10 people between 1974 and 1991 in the Wichita area. He also sent taunting letters to police and newspapers describing his crimes in detail and giving himself his own nickname. He was a church president, a Boy Scout leader, a compliance officer for the city, a man whose literal job was to find people for code violations. He reported his own neighbors for having too many dogs while he was actively one of the most wanted serial killers in America. He went dormant for years. Police thought he might be dead. Then, In 2004, he started sending communications again, apparently because a newspaper article about the 30th anniversary of his first murder suggested BTK had probably died, and he couldn't let that stand. His ego literally ended his freedom. He sent a floppy disk to a local news station. Police metadata traced it back to his church. He was arrested in 2005, confessed almost immediately, and seemed genuinely relieved to finally be able to talk about himself at length. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms because Kansas had abolished the death penalty in 1994, just before his capture. If he'd been caught 10 years earlier, he'd have been executed. Instead, he gets to be an old man in prison, giving interviews and writing memoir chapters. The universe has a very strange sense of irony. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, is also still alive. He is, by confirmed body count, one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. 49 confirmed victims, possibly more than 70. He operated in Washington state through the 1980s and 1990s, targeting sex workers and runaways. Women who, he correctly calculated, would not be immediately reported missing. He was only caught because of DNA evidence. Advances in forensic technology matched him to victims from decades earlier. When police arrested him in 2001, he had been married 3 times, held a steady job painting trucks at a factory for 30 years, and was, by all accounts, an unremarkable neighbor. He avoided the death penalty by agreeing to cooperate, to lead investigators to undiscovered remains, and provide details about victims' fates. For families who had spent years not knowing, this was information worth his life. He has since been largely cooperative with investigators, still occasionally providing details. He is in his mid-70s, housed at the Washington State Penitentiary, serving life without parole. He will die in prison of old age, almost certainly outliving many of the investigators who caught him. Ed Gein? Ed Gein didn't kill that many people, probably 2 confirmed murders. But Ed Gein is on this list, and in every horror movie made between 1960 and the present, because of what he did between the murders. Gein lived alone on a farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. After his mother, the dominant, suffocating, deeply disturbed center of his entire psychological world, died in 1945, he spiraled. He began exhuming bodies from local cemeteries. He made furniture from human bones. He made bowls from skulls. He made a lampshade from a face. He made a vest with breasts from a female torso, which he wore. When police finally searched his farmhouse in 1957, after the disappearance of a local hardware store owner, what they found was documented in photographs that reportedly caused experienced police officers to walk outside and vomit. Gein was found mentally incompetent to stand trial, institutionalized, and spent the rest of his life in mental hospitals. He was eventually tried in 1968, found guilty, but again committed to a mental institution. He was a model patient. Quiet, cooperative, liked to garden. He died on July 26, 1984, from respiratory failure and cancer at Mendota Mental Health Institute. He was 77 years old. His farm burned down under mysterious circumstances before it could become a tourist attraction, which was probably the right outcome for everyone. He inspired Psycho. He inspired Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He inspired Silence of the Lambs. 3 entirely separate horror franchises, one man, one farm in Wisconsin. The most influential person in horror history never released an album. H. Holmes. Holmes operated in the 1890s, which means he did not have forensic science, behavioral profiling, or any of the investigative tools that would eventually make serial killing a less sustainable career choice. What he did have was architecture. Holmes built a hotel in Chicago specifically designed for murder. It had gas lines that fed into sealed rooms. It had a basement with a kiln. It had a body chute. He called it his castle. He opened it to tourists during the 1893 World's Fair, which was one of the most attended events in American history, and the number of people who checked in and never checked out is still debated. Estimates range from 9 confirmed victims to, depending on who you believe, well over 200. He was eventually caught not for the murders but for insurance. Fraud, which is the 1890s equivalent of getting Al Capone on tax evasion. He confessed to 27 murders, then 28, then changed his story multiple times. He may have been exaggerating to sell his story to newspapers. He literally sold his written confession to the Hearst papers. Or he may have been minimizing. Nobody knows. He was hanged on May 7, 1896 at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. He had requested that his coffin be filled with cement and buried deep. Apparently concerned about body snatching, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to worry about if you have spent years doing exactly that. His request was granted. He was 34 years old. His hotel burned down in 1895 under suspicious circumstances. His execution reportedly went smoothly, except for the fact that his neck didn't break cleanly, and he was observed to move for around 15 minutes before dying. He remains one of the most studied figures in criminology. There is a mini-series about him. There are at least 4 books. Eric Larson wrote a bestseller. H.H. Holmes accidentally invented a genre. The Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer was never caught. He killed at least 5 people in Northern California between 1968 and 1969, sent cryptic ciphers to newspapers, taunted police with letters, and then simply stopped. Or he died. Or he moved. Nobody knows. One of his ciphers went unsolved for 51 years and was only cracked in 2020 by a team of amateur code breakers. And even then, it just said that he was collecting slaves for the afterlife, which is both terrifying and deeply unhelpful. Dozens of suspects have been named over the years, none confirmed. The case is technically still open. He may have died of completely unrelated causes, sat in a doctor's office somewhere, complained about his knee, and gone home. He may have been someone's grandfather. He may have been someone who stopped and never started again, which is not as rare as people think. The Zodiac remains the single most famous unsolved serial killer case in American history. There is a David Fincher film. There are podcasts. There are Reddit threads that have been active for 15 years. His death, like his identity, is completely unknown. He was a person. He presumably died at some point. That's the most specific anyone can be. Son of Sam David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, is 72 years old and currently alive in a New York State prison. He killed 6 people and wounded 7 others in New York City between 1976 and 1977, targeting young women and couples in parked cars. He sent letters to police and newspapers that generated enormous media coverage. New York City was genuinely terrified. Clubs emptied out. The tabloids ran front-page stories about him almost daily. He was caught because of a parking ticket. He had left his car illegally parked near the scene of his final shooting. A witness mentioned seeing someone get a ticket near the scene. Police pulled parking records, found his car, and staked out his apartment. He walked out, was immediately recognized, and arrested without incident. He said, "You got me," and smiled. In prison, Berkowitz converted to Christianity and became a vocal prison evangelist. He has repeatedly waived his parole hearings, stating he doesn't feel he deserves to be released. He volunteers for prison programs, corresponds with victims' families in some cases, and has by most accounts made the fullest possible rehabilitation of someone who did what he did. Whether that matters is a question people answer differently depending on who they ask. BTK covered already, but worth noting. Actually, here's an interesting detail about Dennis Rader that didn't fit cleanly in his section. He sent a letter to police asking whether a floppy disk could be traced. Police publicly said no, it could not. He sent the disk. It absolutely could. He was arrested within weeks. He asked the police if his evidence could be traced, and then trusted their answer. The most meticulous, decades-long, detail-obsessed killer undone by believing a press release. Charles Manson. Charles Manson never actually killed anyone himself. This is a fact that surprises people. The murders carried out by the Manson family in 1969, including the murder of Sharon Tate and the La Bianca killings, were committed by his followers. Manson was convicted as the orchestrator, which was a landmark legal theory at the time, and sentenced to death. Then, California abolished the death penalty in 1972. His sentence was commuted to life. Then California reinstated the death penalty in 1978. By that point, Manson's commutation stood. So Charles Manson spent nearly 5 decades in California prisons, giving interviews, applying for parole and being denied, filing bizarre legal motions, corresponding with thousands of people, and becoming the single most recognizable symbol of 1960s counterculture gone catastrophically wrong. He recorded music. People released it. He had followers writing to him in the 2000s, 2010s. He got engaged in his 80s to a woman decades younger who later admitted she was interested in obtaining rights to his body after death, reportedly for a glass coffin display. That engagement fell through. He died on November 19, 2017 at age 83 from cardiac arrest and respiratory failure. He had multiple serious illnesses at the end. He died in a hospital, handcuffed to a bed, his parole having been denied 12 times. His estate was disputed. Multiple people claimed rights to his belongings. A court eventually awarded his estate to a pen pal who had written to him for years. The Manson family's cultural shadow continues to be so large that at least 2 major films and a prestige TV series have been made about him in the years since his death. Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Now here is a genuinely unusual entry. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known as Pedrinho Matador, is a Brazilian serial killer who murdered, by his own accounting, over 70 people. He began killing at age 14. Many of his victims were criminals themselves, gang members, drug dealers, people he considered deserving of death. He killed his own father in prison and reportedly ate part of his heart. He has stated this openly in multiple interviews. He was sentenced to 128 years in prison. Brazilian law caps sentences at 40 years served. He was released in 2007. After release, he became a YouTube personality. He has a channel where he talks about his life, his past, and various topics. He has hundreds of thousands of subscribers. He collaborated with other Brazilian content creators. He has appeared at events. He was rearrested in 2011 on charges related to new crimes. Released again, rearrested. The situation has been complicated. He is, as of the knowledge available here, alive, somewhere in Brazil, possibly filming content. This is a real thing that happened. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman is the most prolific convicted serial killer in history, with 215 confirmed murders and a public inquiry suggesting the actual number could be as high as 250. He was a general practitioner, a family doctor in Hyde, England, who killed mostly elderly female patients by injecting them with lethal doses of diamorphine. He killed for over 20 years. He was trusted, well-liked, considered an excellent doctor by patients who didn't notice that an unusual number of other patients were dying. He was caught when he forged the will of his final victim, Kathleen Grundy, to leave him her estate. Her daughter, a solicitor, was suspicious and demanded an autopsy. The autopsy found fatal quantities of morphine. Police reviewed records. The pattern became undeniable. He was convicted in 2000, sentenced to life, and told by the judge he should never be released. On January 13, 2004, the eve of his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found hanging in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He had tied bed sheets to his cell bars and hanged himself. The most prolific killer in British history denied his victims, their families, and the public any final explanation. No confession, no accounting, no closure. Just a cell and a bedsheet, and a birthday he didn't want to see. One effect of his suicide was financial. Under British pension rules, his wife Primrose would have been entitled to larger survivor benefits if he had died in prison. His death before age 60 meant she received less. This detail is so grim and so mundanely practical that it somehow makes everything worse. Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, killed at least 52 women and children in the Soviet Union over 12 years. He was a school teacher, he was a Communist Party member, he operated in a system that was ideologically committed to the idea that serial killers were a Western phenomenon that could not exist in a socialist society, which meant that investigators were actively discouraged from pursuing the kind of profile that would have caught him years earlier. He was arrested twice and released both times. Once because his blood type appeared to not match evidence. Due to a rare biological quirk, his secreted blood type differed from his actual type. Once because another man confessed under interrogation and was executed for crimes Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet Union executed an innocent man and let the real killer go. He was finally caught in 1990, convicted of 52 murders, and sentenced to death. On February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day, because history has a grotesque sense of staging, Chikatilo was taken to a small room in Novocherkassk prison and shot once behind the ear by a single executioner with a pistol. This was the standard Soviet and Russian method of execution: intimate, immediate, bureaucratic. He was 57. His execution was not announced publicly until after it had occurred. Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was not a traditional serial killer in the psychological profile sense, but he killed 3 people and injured 23 others over a 17-year mail bombing campaign, so he is on this list. He was a mathematics prodigy who graduated from Harvard at 16, got a PhD from Michigan, taught briefly at Berkeley, then retreated to a remote cabin in Montana with no electricity or running water, and spent nearly 2 decades building and mailing bombs to people he associated with industrial technology and modern civilization. He was caught after the New York Times and Washington Post published his 35,000-word manifesto at the FBI's request. His brother David recognized the writing style and turned him in. A Harvard-educated math genius was caught because his own brother read his essay. He was sentenced in 1998 to 8 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. On June 10, 2023, Kaczynski was found unresponsive in his cell at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. He died that morning. He was 81 years old. The cause of death was ruled suicide by hanging. He had been diagnosed with cancer months earlier and transferred to the medical facility. He had reportedly been in declining health. Whatever combination of factors led to his final act, he died as he had lived, on his own terms, rejecting the systems around him, leaving a mess for other people to process. His manifesto is still widely read online. The ideas in it have, in an extremely uncomfortable twist, been cited approvingly by certain technology critics who would presumably not endorse the bombs. History rarely gives clean endings. John List. John List is not a name most people know outside of true crime circles, which is remarkable given what he did. In 1971, List killed his entire family, his wife, his 3 children, and his elderly mother, in their New Jersey mansion. Then he cleaned up, turned on the stereo in the ballroom to play church music, wrote a letter to his pastor explaining that he had sent his family to heaven before they could be corrupted by the world, and disappeared. He was not caught for 18 years. He moved to Colorado, he remarried, he joined a church, he became an accountant. He was by all accounts a pleasant neighbor. He was caught in 1989 after America's Most Wanted aired a segment about him featuring an age-progressed sculpture created by forensic artist Frank Bender. A neighbor of List's in Virginia recognized him, called the Tip Line, and he was arrested within days. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. In prison, he maintained that he had done the right thing, that he had been protecting his family from poverty and moral corruption, that they were in heaven, that he had made the correct decision. He never wavered. John List died in prison on March 21, 2008, of pneumonia. He was 82 years old. He had spent 18 years free and 18 years imprisoned, and he died believing he had done nothing wrong. Joel Rifkin. Joel Rifkin killed 17 women in New York in the early 1990s, making him the most prolific serial killer in New York State history. He was caught in 1993 in a routine traffic stop. Police noticed his truck had no license plate, pulled him over, and found a body in the bed of the truck. He was sentenced to 203 years in prison and is currently serving his sentence at the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York. He is in his mid-60s. He will die in prison. He has given several extensive interviews over the years and has been cooperative with researchers. His case is still studied in criminology